Good afternoon, Leadership 201, and welcome to our kind of unconventional class for today. I do apologize again for the technological error that happened this morning that kind of prevented us from having class regularly together, but really do appreciate your flexibility. So, as I said in my email, I'm going to try to keep this just the facts, kind of just give you a general overview of Dugin's work in critical social theory, positionality, and also social location. So we're going to go ahead and begin. And like I said, I definitely will, our next class, spend some more time answering your questions, going over maybe anything that might seem a little bit murky to you. And this lecture today is kind of the introduction to like a three-part series on the idea of critical social theory and the concept of really understanding, you as a person and as a leader, and being able to take all the things around you in your environment, analyze them critically to kind of help inform your decisions, and also understand how you as a leader interact with your followers and the context in which we operate in. All right, and so just to recap here, last class, we really first talked about breaking down the definition of leadership, and I hope by now you have a general understanding of Northhouse's definition of leadership. If not, I do highly recommend going back and revisiting that. As I said, that's kind of our jumping off point for the rest of the semester when we talk about leadership as this overarching concept. Also from there too, we had a really good conversation about kind of the evolution and history of leadership theory, where it started back in the ancient Greek Roman empires and all the way up to now in modern day when we have some pretty what I like to call obscure and sometimes really innovative theories that really take a lot of into account, the current social situations that we're in as a society. So I really kind of hope that gave you a really good overview and also kind of maybe a little bit of share into how I plan on teaching the class, working with some of those earlier theories and then building off of them until we kind of get to the end of where we're at today. So lastly, also, again, just remember, that Northhouse definition. That's kind of a summary of last class. And if you have any questions about it, obviously reach out to me. More than happy to answer anything. But for now, we're going to kind of shift gears over these next couple of days and talk more about just how to view the world and how to view leadership in a way that is a little bit unique and probably a way that you haven't really ever thought about leadership and about the world and yourself, possibly ever or for a very long time. So we're going to bring in a lot of different theories and concepts. I'm going to try to, give you some tools to then move forward in how you analyze leadership. So as you know, I like to start with a quote of the day, and obviously we really can't select this, and talk about this quote. A really meaningful one and kind of a long one from Kobe Bryant, the late Kobe Bryant, and it's still a timely quote, and still kind of understanding that leadership can be a lonely thing, and it's really there's a big misconception around leadership, but a lot of it stems from this idea of getting uncomfortable and with the unknown and holding yourself accountable and others accountable to that common goal that you share. So, I'll leave it up here for just a second and we can kind of move forward. But I do encourage you to go back and read this quote, as it's a good one and a very meaningful one too, as we progress through this conversation about leadership this semester. So we spent the last class talking about what leadership really is, but one thing that we didn't really have the time, and this entire class is going to cover, is all these different theories. But I want to talk about something first today called implicit leadership theory. Now you might ask what implicit leadership theory is. It sounds very formal and deep, but really what ILT, us as critical leadership scholars talk about is it being what we call a bookend theory. So it's something that's really applicable to all theories. So whether we're talking about situational leadership or adaptive leadership, this theory is kind of a bookend to that. And it's something that can help us better understand a theory and how it applies to the real world. So what ILT really is and what it focuses on is this concept of, consistency between how people perceive leaders, and how they should act, they should be, and how leaders actually are. So, a lot of the times in our head, and we had a lot of conversation about this already, is that, we have internally this kind of idea of the qualities and traits and skills that are necessary to be a leader, be a good leader. But often, we sometimes hold leaders to this light and kind of this understanding that they are all of those things, when in reality, sometimes they're not. Or sometimes they don't embody all of the pieces of a theory or, the expectations we have for leadership. So implicit leadership theory really brings to light the understanding that, sometimes the way that we perceive things or the way that we perceive the process of leadership isn't really how it, kind of plays out. So in implicit leadership theory, we have this, thing that we talk about prototypes. And, we kind of create these prototypes in our mind, like I said, that, if we're, a very bold personality, ready to charge forward, we have a lot of power, really likable, we might be a leader. But, in the reality, that's not always how it works in the real world. Sometimes leadership is more of a subtle interaction. And some of these strongly definitive traits and personalities that we, have in our mind as this prototype of leadership aren't always true. And this can be really problematic sometimes because, as human nature, I feel like we're relatively a stubborn, type of species, and it can be problematic because sometimes we may resist new information, or things that actually challenge what's in our head. And I find it really important for this class moving forward that you're going to hear some different concepts and some ideas and, some different ways of thinking about leadership that you may have never thought about before. And it might be, your nature as a human being to resist that right away, because we have in our minds this idea of what leadership is and what it should be. But nonetheless, sometimes when we hear this new information, we may be resistant to change. So really the idea of implicit leadership theory is kind of bringing to light, the idea that us as humans, we're kind of resistant to changing what we think about something or how we perceive something. So, it's important with implicit leadership theory to make sure that we are constantly questioning and constantly changing our, viewpoints and opinions about these things we call prototypes. So moving on to the next slide here, let's talk about this concept of theory. So we just talked about implicit leadership theory, and you're going to hear me say the word theory 1,000 times throughout the semester, just because we are talking about, leadership theory and, theory and practice especially. So if you had the opportunity to read Dugan, already, and I'm not going to bore you to death today with this, lecture on theory. I'm sure if you've ever taken a science class or a social science class like psychology or sociology, you've probably been grilled to death with all of this idea of, what is theory? How do we perceive theory? This type of thing, hypothesis, all of these type of, concepts. I'm not going to do that today. I think a lot of us probably have a pretty good grasp of that. But what I am going to talk about is, what Dugan, who we, really have a lot of, groundwork coming from Dugan in this class, is that Dugan in his work in 2017, so very recent work, he talks a lot about this idea of critical social theory, what we're going to spend a lot of time on today. But Dugan says, theory is often something that we present as a society, something authoritative, applicable to all situations, and it's kind of a means to an end, to all of these problems that we have in society. And, we often kind of take these theories from these scientists and historians and people of, higher, what we would call higher regard in society, and we kind of take them as truth. But in reality, theory is, not some intractable truth. Um, you know, just because somebody says that something is the way and the means of doing something does not mean it's actually true. And, we often as a society kind of wrap our minds around this concept that, a theory truly is just, it's fact, it's what we got to go by. But at the end of the day, a theory is just someone's work. It's kind of their life dedication, whether they're a, doctoral student or, a PhD doing research somewhere. It's kind of just, their summary of findings, their thoughts, their opinions. Sometimes it's peer reviewed, sometimes it's not. And that's some things that, in life moving forward, we have to be really cognizant of. And, as we consume information, we sometimes take things for face value when in reality, it's not always the truth, not always covers all these situations. So what Dugan says in his work is that, theory is one of these many potentialities. What that means is that it's something that is possible, it could happen. But it changes. Theory is really born of this concept of what we call imperfect understandings of an imperfect world, which means, this might be great in a vacuum. It might be great in a society that we're able to manipulate all of these variables. But in reality, sometimes life happens, and sometimes we have these external factors that change the theory, change the process. And this is applicable to all types of theory, not just leadership. You know, theory, like I was just saying, really doesn't explain, the meanings of the world. It suggests really more that we need to have a new understanding of what we thought was meant. And it really kind of in itself just reveals some of these complexities and leaves some of these unanswered questions a lot of times when we talk about theory. So one thing with theory, it's never accurate. And it's also never sometimes wrong. Really what theory is in essence is kind of illuminating, bringing to light some of these things that make us think more deeply about phenomena. You know, if we have a certain type of theory about something, really what a theory should do is to kind of help you question your current perception, what we talked about earlier, that prototype of, a certain concept. So really theory should be thought provoking, but it shouldn't be the law. It's not the letter of the law with any means. And what I mean really by that is you don't have to agree with theory. Um, although here in academia, we often teach a lot of theory, and obviously I'm going to assess you on the things that come from theory from really high regarded leadership scholars. Nonetheless, you don't have to agree with them. It's something you have to bring to heart and kind of adapt your leadership style to meet this theory or meet this cookie cutter mold. But instead, as a society and as a person, we need to question these theories. We need to, understand that we can't expect every single theory to cater to absolutely every person, every situation, every leadership interaction, because simply that just wouldn't work. We're all unique people. And in this class, we're 33, 34, if you include me, very different people, all bring unique perspectives. And what we'll talk about in a little bit, positionality, we all bring this unique thing to the table. So why should we take something that is black and white and, ignore all those gray areas, those nuances that make us unique in society? So one quote that really resonates with me personally from Dugin's work is that he says, when the theory fails us, does not reflect us, or requires us to take ownership of its interpretation and application, it may be simply easier just to reject it wholesale. And what Dugin's, saying about that is that sometimes when we see a theory in society and it doesn't meet the mold of who we are, sometimes we just go ahead and toss it out, don't consider it. But throughout these next couple of lectures, I really hope to give you the tools to be able to take any theory, reconstruct it in a way that really helps you apply it to your life. And really, theories are never wrong, like I said, but they are really meant to be deconstructed, examined critically. We love to use this word critical lens in this class, and then reconstructed with our own lived experiences and insights, which we call our positionality. So, and that's kind of my spiel on theory. And in essence, like I said, I'm not going to bore you to death with what makes a theory, but understand that we should always be questioning what a theory is and how it impacts us as leaders and also those around us. So really this next concept and what we're going to talk a lot about these next couple of classes is idea of critical social theory. So we just talked about theories, but now we're going to kind of hone in on a specific type of theory that is really going to kind of help us understand from a leadership perspective all of the things around us, both personally and also external to the world. And really what critical social theories are, they kind of offer these conceptual accounts of the social world that kind of help to understand and explain structural inequality, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And, really the idea of critical social theory is to examine things with a critical lens and understand how there's impacts on society, who it affects. So in other words, critical social theory really focuses on the flows of power in society. And we'll talk a lot about power. Personally, I love power and talking about how power in a leadership interaction occurs. And you'll see me in the next couple of weeks here talk a lot about power. So, but CST really focuses on just that, how power has an impact on what we call the social stratification, so the layers of our social society. And then theory CSTs really get at the heart of how we can be more just and fair and create equitable experiences for everybody, not just those that are, bound to a certain layer of society or, applied to by a certain theory. And all of this will make sense. We'll do some exercises in our next class that really kind of hone in on each of these. But with critical social theory, there's these 5 major tenets that make a critical social theory. So we'll kind of go through them here. And the first thing that critical social theory does, and we just talked about it in theory, is this idea of direct rejection of positivism. What that means is that a critical social theory rejects the idea that everything has to be justified by science. Sometimes, science in itself, although a great thing that contributes to the world, kind of forgets about, like I said, those nuances, those things that occur in the natural world that aren't always easily justified by scientific explanation. So sometimes we have to reject that and understand that theory has more applications just than its scientific nature, both physical science, social science, anything like that. Another thing that critical social theory presumes is this idea of structural inequality. And, no matter to what extent, I'm sure we've all experienced the structural inequality in some way, especially in the modern Western world. There is inequality in society due to, economic inequality, racism, classism. And we see a lot of this be coming to light here in recent times, and also just throughout the, modern history of, post-industrialization here in the US. People make different amounts of money. We have racial inequalities. We have, things that exist here in the world that we have to bring to light. So anything that is a critical social theory and talks about critical social theory brings to light the idea that we need to understand that there is inequality, and we have to figure out how we're going to fix that, how we're going to adjust these theories to make it suitable to everybody that's unequal within our structure. The next thing that critical social theory does is disrupts assumptions. So the goal of critical social theory is to make the implicit explicit. And what I mean is take all of those things, those biases, all of those things that we hold individually as society and as a person, and bringing to light. So we kind of, acknowledge our blind spots, and we have the knowledge of those to kind of help make our structure be able to change. So we use critical social theory as a tool to help bring those to light and then make that positive social change, or the concept of what we like to usually call social justice even. The next two, and these are very important to understand, is that one of the other tenets of critical social theory is the idea that it envisions agency within structure. And with critical social theory, there's this belief that people, have the ability to shape and control their own life within a structure. And really, this idea of CST holds people responsible for their own liberation and gives them the tools to be able to adapt and overcome some of these boundaries that we face in the life, but also warns these people, don't oppress others in the name of their own future liberation. So we have a really idea, we just brought to light these assumptions of structural inequality, but now we need to make sure too that whenever we're working through these means of social inequalities, that we can make sure that we're not oppressing others too, because then again, that just kind of creates this cyclical motion of structural inequality, which we don't want. And the last thing with critical social theory and using the tools of this is that it advances the idea of social change. So a lot of this work of critical social theory comes from social justice. And it's probably a term that you've heard pretty frequently, even in the past couple of months. I mean, with all of the different demonstrations that have occurred across our country demanding for change in certain aspects, especially when it comes to race relations and other concepts. The idea of critical social theory is one of the great things you can apply to this and really have a better understanding of what's occurring in our society, is that the idea that things that are being representative by a critical social theory is that it advances social change, and it takes these assumptions that we have about society, about people, about those that are in the different layers of our society. We disrupt them. We then envision kind of this new light, and we by either the means of just taking action or creating an intervention. And ultimately, our goal is to have a more just and fair future for everybody involved. So, this might seem like a lot, and I will continue to explain this and build upon this over the next couple of classes about what critical social theory is and kind of what it can be in the light of leadership, especially, but more importantly, overall in our society, some of the big social issues that we face. So, when we talk about critical social theory, we just talked about the 5 tenets, and then we're going to talk a little bit more, just kind of to wrap this first portion of class up with the idea of some of these central themes and some of the things that we possess as individuals that maybe make up what we call this concept of positionality. And you'll hear me use interchangeably this phrase positionality or social location. They mean the exact same thing. They're synonymous terms, but I'll kind of do a little bit more deep dive here in just a minute about what that truly means. Obviously, because you are writing a paper called My Leadership Journey, it's a paper about positionality. And I also posted on eCampus too a link to a great video where a gentleman actually kind of explains his own personal positionality. It's kind of a great way just to reflect on your own and understand maybe some of the things that you want to include in this assignment. And we'll talk more about the assignment later as well. So the first part of critical social theory's central themes is this idea of stocks of knowledge. And what stocks of knowledge really are is kind of for face value. They really serve as these socially constructed assumptions about how the world should operate, which often can be subject to error. It's something that we perceive as individuals, and these are these things that we kind of just hold as truths in our lives. And there's something that we rarely take a look at because they're so familiar to us. And they're useful for us because they really kind of help us navigate the world as we see it, even if they're not necessarily accurate. And a lot of this comes from the idea of socialization, lived experiences we have. And this can kind of bring us briefly into the nature versus nurture debate, but sometimes we grow up kind of knowing the way, and it may not be the way of the world. Coming to college is a great experience for that because you see how everybody has these different stocks of knowledge around the world. Even think about it as something as simple about things that we call, like one of my favorite debates, soda versus pop versus Coke. Three different areas of the world have a different stock of knowledge about what they would call this item. And, is it wrong? Is it right? Personally, I think it's soda, but I'm not going to sit here and fight. But we are so familiar about this term, we rarely analyze kind of the meaning behind things. And I know that's kind of a superficial, easy example, but nonetheless, we have these lived experiences that we have that cause us to think the way that we do. And the only time that we can really change that or impact that is when we bring them into question. We're actively, as an individual or even as a society or a micro unit of society, bringing those into question. So, I use a little bit heavier example of the idea of racism. And some people kind of make the general assumption and sometimes make the general statement, even whether you agree with it or not, that it's just kind of the way I was raised. And some people see it's okay just because the fact that they never bring it into question. We don't change that. We don't understand kind of what's happening in society because we're so jaded and so driven in our way that we're not really actively trying to change that experience because it's what we know. And although it's not accurate by any means, we have to bring that into question constantly and understand our positionality and who we are as a person and what our society brings to make us up. And then that's how we can actually have an influence on our stocks of knowledge and create this social change, which we'll talk a lot about in our next class, because it's so important to understand how as leaders we can influence social change for things that are really pressing in our society as a whole, not just for those that are following us and not just the smaller context that we're a leader in, but ultimately creating social justice and resisting things that are terrible in our world, like economic depressions and also racism. Obviously, we want to learn some tools that we can utilize as both people and as units of leaders that we can help influence and make a change in our world, because it's really what this is all about in critical social theory. So we'll move on to this next concept, and this is kind of a concept that's a little bit broader. It focuses more on society as a whole and not just these certain pieces of society or as individuals. It's this idea of what we call ideologies and hegemonies. So in ideology, you've probably heard this phrase before, is that, this is kind of this broadly accepted set of values and beliefs and myths and explanations and justifications, all of these great buzzwords that we possess as a society at large. And, kind of in some of the works of, whether you agree with it or not, or whether it's, kind of brought to light, but comes from something like, a Marxist society, ideologies are really kind of meant to maintain this unjust social political order. And sometimes because we bring it onto ourselves as a society and we talk about it, and it kind of becomes a land of the law and lay of the law, and really we don't bring it into question. So it's something that has a high influence on our ability to look at and kind of reject and make these changes through the lens of critical social theory. And we also have this other thing that's a hegemony, which we call, it's more of a subtle form of social control that we have in society we don't often think about. And it's really this idea that sometimes we have an acceptance, whether it's right or wrong, that there's a dominant group that's having impact on us. So I like to utilize maybe the example of thinking back to elementary school. And with a hegemony, especially, you may have something like student council or like a class president or something. Subtly, we kind of accepted the fact that maybe that student council was like the best of the school. They ran the school, they were in charge, you were a dominant group. But we maintained that as an acceptance and never really questioned it. One, because we were kind of naive, probably as elementary school students. Even kind of using the example removing student council, I'm thinking of like, when you're sitting there in first grade, you think a sixth grader or a seventh grader is like, they're a full-blown adult. We kind of have this idea that they're more of a dominant group. We're kind of a lesser population compared to them. And when in reality, that's not true, but we never really took the time to question that. And a lot of it also stems from the ideas of ideology. We kind of create within our education system almost this classist order that, a first grader is worse than a second grader, and kind of works its way up until you're a senior in high school or whatever. And it kind of is a way to almost create like this unjust order that we have. And it's almost like a coercive thing that happens. And, I could overanalyze that a lot, but really just kind of a way to give you an example of a lighthearted one at best about what these really are. So, kind of have the idea that ideologies and hegemonies are important to understand because, at large as society, we have this influence on us to why we're not actually questioning some of these things. The next part I want to talk about, and the one that's I feel most important that we're really going to touch a lot in this class, is this idea of positionality, of social location. I just threw this image up here that kind of shows and brings to light all of these things that come into making who you are. So we have things like race, religious affiliation, age, your native language. Everyone has different, backgrounds in terms of socioeconomic status, and everybody's coming to WVU for different degrees, and maybe has had different paths to get here. There's different genders that we have, and sexualities, and abilities, capabilities. So all of these things, make you you, and you're really unique as your own fingerprint in the sense that I'm sure that every single person, nobody in this class, has all the exact same things on this list, and that's okay because that's what makes us great. And using our positionality and our social location, we have the ability to really influence a lot of these ideas of social change, and using critical social theory, using that lens and that tool. So we'll talk here really quickly about positionality and social location and kind of how they have influence. So as I said before, these are synonymous terms. You'll hear me use them interchangeably. And positionality is kind of my favorite words to use, but we can also use social location. So I'll try to keep that in mind and pick one. But like I said, positionality is kind of the position that we hold in society based on a variety of these identities that we have. And, they include things like your job, your geographic location, your sexual orientation, race, gender, everything that makes you you. It makes you unique. More importantly, is your positionality, your place in this world based on who you are and what you possess. So our social positionality are, strongly shaped by kind of these three major terms that Dugan cites in his work. And the first one is the sense of who we are in relation to others. That's our identity, that kind of what makes us unique. Also, our social position really is influenced too by what we know about ourselves and the world. So that's kind of those ideologies and hegemonies there. And also just general knowledge about the world too, the stocks of knowledge too. And then also we kind of, what can we do with ourselves and others in the world? And that's that power component. That's the influence and kind of the belief that you can make social change. So a lot of this kind of goes in and has influence from the positionality, the place that we're in, that identity that we have. And, positionality really is, like I said, that social, political, societal context that creates your identity. And positionality really asks people to understand how all these different identity markers that we possess uniquely as individuals inform how we see the world and how the world also sees us. And ultimately, the goal of positionality and understanding positionality is understanding that how your identities, how your experiences, your biases, all of the things that make you you, potentially can change and impact the understanding you have on the outlook of the world, things of like leadership, for example. Some of these abstract concepts we bring in, your thoughts of leadership are strongly probably influenced by how you grew up, how your parents may have raised you, or how your early careers and leaders that were influential early on in your life have impacted you. So really taking away from this, but the idea of positionality is really important to understand that, what makes you you also has a great influence on how you interact with this concept of leadership and how we, apply that into the real world and how we maybe create change. And like I said, this next class, we're going to talk a lot about some tools that we can have in our belt to take a really abstract problem and sometimes remove some of these things that have influence on it and objectively look how we can make it better for society as a whole as leaders, and also just to kind of help correct the social injustices that sometimes we face in the world. So I promised I'd keep this as concise as I could. I hope you have a general understanding of some of the core tenets of what Dugin's saying in critical social theory. And for next class, we'll really talk, like I said, about these tools of deconstruction and reconstruction and how we can apply positionality to leadership more specifically. And lastly, we'll do some more talking about the My Leadership Journey paper, because after today and the next lecture, you should be well prepared to start writing more about your positionality and who makes you you, and how that actually may have influence on the world that you see around you in both a leadership context and at large. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you next class. Have a great weekend, and please be safe. Thank you.